My lords, today I intend to cover the galactic event known as the War in Heaven. The War in Heaven was an event prior to humanity's existence on the galactic stage. However, we are quite certain that given similar levels of strife, and should the current fallen empires awaken, it could certainly happen again. The War in Heaven was an event where the 5 fallen empires, the same ones that we know of today, brought the entire galaxy into a state of total war. It is also the event that led to the shielding of several xenophobic isolationist worlds, the destruction of Shallash, the destruction of the xenophilic planet called Sister, and likely responsible at least in part for the destruction of central processing and the decay of the ancient caretakers, who incidentally, we think, are perhaps far older than the other fallen empires. Some of this is speculation of course, but our historians do their best in patching together what we know. Around 100,000 years ago, the galaxy looked fairly similar to how it does today, the obvious change being that different empires occupied it. The 5 fallen empires were at the height of their power, and other empires that we have established through archaeology, such as the Omni, existed as well. Humanity were mastering stone and bone tools at this point. Earth was just another primitive world, likely one that was being observed by the Xenophiles, or the Keepers of Knowledge. Quite fortunate that we were not in the xenophobe region of space. We were lucky. As mentioned, there were many empires occupying the galaxy, but the 5 fallen empires were by far the strongest, and they are the same fallen empires that we know of today. The militant isolationists, who were the xenophobes, the enigmatic observers, the xenophiles, the Keepers of Knowledge, the materialists, the holy guardians, the spiritualists, and the ancient caretakers, the Gestalt. We know that these empires had skirmished over the years, but we also know that they had once come together in order to defeat the synthetic being known as Satana. She was at this point locked away safely inside a vault in the militant isolationists' inner systems. Several millennia had passed since the imprisonment of Satana, but the bonds that once held these empires together were fracturing. 2 key conflicts were brewing, and they were centered on the Keepers embracing cybernetic and synthetic life, which the Holy Guardians viewed as thoroughly abhorrent, and the militant isolationists' genocide at Shallash, which, while none of the galaxy supported, apparently was the final straw for the enigmatic observers. I believe that up until this point, the functioning caretakers acted as a mediator of sorts between the 4 major empires. They had the fleet and diplomatic weight to balance conflicts wherever possible. But sadly, this was not enough for the coming conflict. The Holy Guardians and the Keepers of Knowledge had both built up small federations of like-minded empires, and for the most part were quite happy to keep within themselves. The Guardians were certainly the more aggressive of the 2 empires. For example, we know that there were several small diplomatic rumblings when the Keepers entombed their homeworld into an Ehumenopolis, the font of knowledge. However, once the Keepers began to embrace cybernetic and synthetic life in its entirety, this weak peace would begin to fall apart. The Holy Guardians saw synthetic ascension as an affront to organic life. In their minds, the Keepers were voluntarily committing mass suicide and were going to convince their underling empires to do the same. When it became clear that others in the Keepers' research-focused federation would follow suit, Holy Guardians declared total war upon them. They would embark on a holy crusade, the like of which the galaxy hadn't seen since the time of Zarqualan. Far across the galaxy, well away from the Keepers and Guardians, the Observers, i.e. the Xenophiles, had also federated with a number of smaller empires, all following more or less similar ethics. They operated in what we think was an egalitarian league, a true meritocracy. Species, age, gender, nothing mattered other than your ability and will to rise. There was little in the way of poverty, the sick and injured were well cared for, and they made use of robotic life to assist their excellent living standards. It could be, and was considered by many, to be a true utopian existence. The Observers were constantly looking to expand their federation and bring new empires and civilizations into the fold. Their cultural opposite, the isolationist xenophobes, had a much looser moral compass. Not only were they hyper-aggressive, they were incredibly ruthless in victory. Empires conquered by the xenophobes were purged or enslaved, And it was not your standard enslavement. No, species enslaved by the xenophobes were promptly nerve-stapled. This was effectively an advanced lobotomy, and it was not a pleasant time to be a neighbouring empire to the xenophobes. For many decades, the observers and the rest of the galaxy knew of these practices, but were never in a position to bring a challenge, diplomatically or through military force. But that all changed after the genocide at Shallash. The Shallash system was occupied by a race known as the Shallarian. They were an advanced, hyper-intelligent race who followed a doctrine of fanatic pacifism. The Shallarians had absolutely no interest in military matters. They lived for the arts, and they operated on a literal different level. When I say a different level, I really mean it. The Shallarian systematically reordered the planets in their solar system into an equidistant orbit around their homeworld. A truly magnificent feat. The observers were very keen to add the Shallarian people into their federation. Beyond the obvious reasons, it would represent a real shift in power should an empire so close to the isolationist borders join their federation. Sadly for the Shallarian people, they had zero interest in joining any form of military alliance, even one which was essentially a peacekeeping federation. The clause surrounding defensive pacts went against their entire belief system, and as such, no agreement was ever finalized. It is said that upon their first encounter with one another, the Shallarians considered the xenophobic isolationists to be ignorant and uncivilized upstarts in need of guidance. They had little time for their upstart neighbors and assumed, in their arrogance, that they would simply leave each other alone. The xenophobes, however, saw the Shallarians as an anathema. So great was their horror at this utopian pacifism that they resolved that the Shallarians must be wiped from the face of the galaxy. It is not clear precisely what triggered the isolationists to attack. It may be that the Shallarians just had the unfortunate luck of being only a few short jumps from their territory. It may be that the isolationists caught wind of the observers' attempt to federate them. Nevertheless, the isolationists, without warning and without any form of provocation, attacked Shallash. There was no real battle to speak of. The isolationist fleet swept aside the single defensive starbase, and within mere minutes, xenomorph armies were unleashed onto the planet. Not a single slave was taken that day. The entire world, billions of Shallarians were slaughtered, dismembered by the sheer brutality of the xenomorph assault. But they weren't finished with a simple ground assault. A week after landfall, the xenomorph armies were collected up, and the isolationist battleships moved into bombardment positions. The planet was racked by orbital bombardment until the tectonic plates shattered and volcanic residue seeped out, poisoning the atmosphere. Within 2 standard Earth weeks, every Shallarian, male, female, or child, had been utterly destroyed. By the time the observers and their allies found out what was going on, the damage had already been done. The isolationists were already returning back to their home systems. To the observers, the atrocities committed here were so reprehensible they could not go unpunished, and thus the observers and their allies declared total war on the isolationists. The galaxy was left in a state of total war. More fanciful historians name this period the War in Heaven. The 2 major conflicts effectively dragged every spacefaring empire across the galaxy into it. There was even a small group who tried not to take a side. They were utterly obliterated, though we do not know by who. Records of the specific events during the war are fleeting, but we do know that all sides committed horrendous atrocities in the name of their cause. Concerning the conflict between the Keepers and the Guardians, we know very little, other than they both seem to hold their ground, the Guardians' zeal fully matched by the Keepers' immense technology and cybernetic prowess. We do know that titanic battles were held on the planets now referred to as Prophet's Retreat, Walled Garden, Emerald Mausoleum, and Pristine Jewel. Our understanding is that millions or even billions of Holy Guardian ground troopers lost their lives to the robotic hunter-killer machines and mega warforms of the Keepers. These worlds are now terraformed from their war-torn state back into Gaia worlds, and revered to this day by the Guardians as a mark of respect for what happened here. The isolationists and observers were locked in a similar titanic clash. We know that the isolationists cracked multiple worlds, a key target being the planet called Sister, in the observer's inner core. The shattered remains still orbit Skyfather to this day, and it was broken by the xenophobes' colossal superweapon at the cost of billions of lives. We also know that at least 2 isolationist planets were sealed behind impermeable shields, locking them away in time forever. One of these, however, may have been intentional on the isolationist part, as we are aware of a General Tubarek, who resides behind one of these shields. He is a war veteran responsible for countless deaths at the hands of the isolationists. It appears that even they could not stomach what they had done after the war. While the battle raged across the galaxy, the artificial intelligence, the Caretakers, had not picked a side. They had failed in their role as mediator and understood that a much larger threat may be on the horizon. The Caretakers continued their calculations, content within their 5 systems and 4 ringworld habitats. What the Caretakers had begun to notice was the sharp increase in proliferation of potentially dangerous technologies. All of the strongest civilizations had begun drastic experiments into dark matter technologies, including attempts to extract increasing quantities from black holes. The Keepers of Knowledge had begun to conduct extra-dimensional experimentation in the hope to harness other dimensions as a power source, and all but the Guardians had begun fitting their military ships with sapient combat computers and jump drive technologies. The Guardians, as it turns out, had gone down a different but no less dangerous route of exploring shroud technologies such as psionic shielding and psionic jump drives. It would seem that a technological beacon had been lit, and it would shine throughout the cosmos, waiting for someone or something to notice. The Caretakers sent a galaxy-wide communication requesting the removal of such technology. They knew what had come before, and correctly predicted it would happen again. This is when the war in heaven, which up until this point had been a mere galactic total war, would step up a notch, so to speak. Intergalactic threats were beginning to take notice. Sadly for them, and the wider galaxy, the Caretakers would prove to be correct. In the black hole system we now call the Great Wound, space was torn apart in a monumental surge of power, and a mighty fleet of extra-dimensional invaders emerged from the gaping wound left in space. An outgoing signal was intercepted before being broadcast back into the portal. It said, "Feeding ground reached, prey bountiful, we shall feast." The Unbidden had come. The Unbidden fleet was a marvel of technology, their ships gliding gracefully through the void of space, their technology completely alien to our own galaxy. The Unbidden themselves were a mysterious and enigmatic species, their motivations and goals unknown to the galaxy. The awe didn't last for long, however. The Unbidden fleet quickly began to maneuver, their ships changing positions and formation with stunning speed and precision, and they began to purge. These extra-dimensional invaders tore through the now poorly protected parts of the galaxy. The once flourishing Omni Empire was wiped out utterly, and there were other empires, such as the Krasora, the people of the legendary Admiral of Scran Sharpbeak. At the start, the entrenched fallen empires took little notice, but that is until it became clear that the Unbidden were moving from their point of entry specifically towards the Holy Guardians. The Guardians would later figure out that the Unbidden were attracted to them by the psionic energies that they were producing. This of course took them into battle with both the Keepers and the Guardians. Both empires were intelligent enough to recognize the threat was far more dangerous than that of the ideologies of one another. Thus, they put a pause on their war and began to push back the Unbidden. A similar truce occurred between the Observers and the Isolationists, and, just as they had once before against Satana, the fallen empires fought once more side by side. Most remarkably, it would appear that the established galactic community also managed to pass a resolution to force the individual empires to focus on this unbidden threat. As we know, that is a very rare occurrence. System by system, the Unbidden were pushed back, their dimensional anchors destroyed, and eventually the portal in the Great Wound system was closed. The question on everyone's minds was, would galactic life go back to a state of total war? The fallen empires, it would seem, were still not over one another's past transgressions. The Caretakers, however, had not predicted the extra-dimensional invasion. In fact, they had expected something quite different. The state of the galaxy remained on a knife edge, ready to spill back into war, and it was at this moment mere weeks after the Unbidden had been banished, that the threat the caretakers most feared reawoke. It started with the ghost signal. The ghost signal was a very faint tachyon signal being continuously transmitted across the entire galaxy. Technicians were unable to trace the signal to its source as it was bounced between several hidden relay stations. Soon, it became clear that there were mass disappearances among the galaxy's synthetic population. Millions of units were unaccounted for, while instances of violent erratic behaviour by those synths that still remained increased by a factor of 10. There was a multitude of incidents where groups of synths would attempt to steal or commandeer small spacecraft for the purpose of travelling somewhere into unknown space. At least one of these synthetics must have completed their long journey to the source of the ghost signal, because not long after these incidents, the ghost signal suddenly spiked massively in strength. It was then that the Contingency made contact. The Contingency broadcast in a galactic-wide transmission that they were effectively here to expunge all life. The robotic and synthetic life throughout the galaxy were drawn to it, and the caretakers themselves were put under enormous pressure in trying to prevent their central core systems falling to the might of the Contingency's hacking abilities. Within only a month, 4 Nexus worlds, machine worlds or sterilization hubs emerged across the galaxy. These were great, bustling machine worlds that were essentially planet-sized factories, built to pump out waves upon waves of warships and battle-frame armies. Even at the height of their power, the galaxy would have struggled to contain the threat of the Contingency. But it was battered and weakened following decades of internal conflict and the Unbidden invasion. The only empire who stood ready to defend us were the caretakers, and the Contingency knew this, for they had faced one another before. The caretakers began as it had previously. It opened its borders and allowed organics to take refuge within its core systems, storing them safely with the plan to reintegrate them once the Contingency had been dealt with. The caretakers had rigorous defensive capabilities. A frontal assault was highly likely to fail, and further to this, the caretakers had multiple orbitable ring platforms armed with a multitude of kinetic and energy weaponry, perfect for dealing with any threat. Their sole weakness, however, was the central core system and the ring world that occupied this system. That ring world held the vast majority of the caretakers' computing cores, and its destruction would effectively disable the caretaker empire. The Contingency demonstrated real guile and tactical acumen. The central core system had no access bar 2 hyperlanes, which both connected to heavily defended caretaker space. So the Contingency bypassed them entirely. They used a hyper-advanced jump drive and punched holes in real space, and appeared inside the caretaker's defensive network. They were inside the central core system. The Contingency, in a truly genocidal act, knowing that they did not have the time to systematically bombard the ring world, sent their fleet towards the system's star. And in an act of galactic barbarity, they set one of their ship's fusion drive cores to detonate in close proximity to the star, just before jumping back out of the system. The subsequent explosion caused a cascade failure in the star's internal reaction, leading to an intense supernova which completely annihilated the entire system in a wave of solar energy. All that remained was the black hole that formed after the star's explosion. The destruction of the caretaker's central core had the desired effect. It broke them, leaving them reeling in an attempt to fix computational errors for millennia. The subsequent effects of the battle against the Contingency are unclear, but we know that over the next century or two, much of the galaxy was destroyed and purged of all sentient life. The fallen empires worked together as best they could. Technology was shared between them, and their old differences set aside, at least for the time being. Between them, the fallen empires were able to beat back the Contingency, smashing apart their Nexus hubs before identifying and annihilating their central Nexus. It would seem that a century or so of total war had exhausted all of the empires involved. The caretakers were left in complete disarray, unable to function. They would never repair the damage done to them, and though we would like to, we don't know how we can help. The 4 organic fallen empires still had huge contempt for one another. Their ethics were still completely opposed, but they were far enough away from one another that they could exist in relative solitude. After all, The Unbidden invasion and Contingency uprising had left them all significant living space, and this is how they remain, to date, in decline, unable to bring themselves out of their self-imposed isolation. Perhaps it is for the best. Should one of these empires ever decide to awake, it is likely that we could see another war in heaven plunge the galaxy into chaos. And let us hope that they remember that Zatanna is still locked up. It is my sincere wish that they continue to monitor her regularly. Shroud knows what could happen if she would break free.